Hey everyone, professional photographer Ian Plant here, and in each episode of the Photo Critique, I offer thoughtful critiques of viewer-submitted photos. And for this episode, I challenged everyone to get creative with shooting into the light, and I can't wait to see what you guys came up with. And please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Shuttermonkeys here on YouTube, and ring that bell so you always know when we drop our next helpful video. Hey guys, and welcome to the Photo Critique. Before we get started, I just want to give a quick shout out to Hunt's Photo and Video for helping make these episodes possible. Hunt's makes personal service part of every purchase, and their friendly, knowledgeable staff can assist you in selecting the perfect gear. Every episode, I will choose my favorite photo from the ones that were submitted, and Hunt's will give that photographer a $50 gift card. Alright, so for this episode, I asked everyone to get creative with shooting into the light. So working with silhouettes, including the sun star in your photo, you know, that sort of thing. So generally, what you want to do when you're shooting into the light is to have a subject that is translucent or transparent, so it's got some light passing through it, so the subject itself becomes backlit. Or you want a subject that is reflective, so it's reflecting some of the light and the color that you've got elsewhere. That's always a good strategy as well. Or you can choose a moment when the light is high enough so that there's actually some light that is striking most of your scene. So maybe you've got a mix of light and shadow, but what you don't want is, for example, with a landscape photo, you don't want the landscape to be completely in shadow and be not reflective and not have anything that's really standing out, because it can otherwise turn into this sort of featureless, formless mass without any contrast or any real color. So when you're shooting into the light, you have to choose your subject matter carefully to make sure that you've got a scene or a subject that actually works with this shooting into the light approach. And all I've got to say about your submissions is, wow, you guys did a great job. There were so many incredible photos that were submitted for this critique episode. And so for once, I get to focus on what you guys have done right rather than focusing on the many, many things that you guys are doing wrong. Of course, I'm just kidding. The submissions are always great. But you know, I am a little bit angry because you guys did give me so many great photos. It's going to make my job really difficult as we dive right into the photo critique. This first photo was submitted by Jure. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce your name. I apologize profusely. I'm probably getting it wrong. As a matter of fact, I get emails all the time from people saying, Ian, you got my name wrong. And I am sorry. So I apologize to everyone whose name I've mispronounced in the past, and for every name I will mispronounce in the future. I am doing the best that I can. So Jure, I may get your name wrong, but I'm going to say some wonderful things about your photo, so I hope that makes up for it. This is an amazing photo. This is a backlit swan on Lake Bled in Slovenia, and this was taken on a cold winter morning. And I love everything about it. This is pretty much a perfect photo. The swan is a perfect subject for backlighting. So when you're shooting into the light, you want to make sure you've got the right subject. So if you're photographing a black rock, for example, and you've got the sun behind it, you're not really going to see anything of that black rock. It's just going to go completely into shadow. But a subject like this swan with those white feathers is translucent, so those white feathers will backlight and they will seem to glow from within magically. So this is a perfect subject for backlighting. So I love the swan. I love the fact that you waited for the swan to open its wings, so it's got a really dynamic pose. And I also love that castle in the background, that little hint of mist. Everything came together really perfectly for this photo. So one thing that you might want to think about is, I noticed that you've got this photo arrayed vertically. So you've got the swan at the bottom and then the castle in the background, and they are lined up completely vertically. And that's fine. That actually works perfectly well for this composition. But for a scene like this, you may want to consider shifting your position left or right to change that vertical relationship into a diagonal relationship. So here, because the swan is actually looking out from the middle of the frame to the left, I would think that the best thing to do would have been to shift a little bit to the left. And as you do that, as you shift to the left, I got to keep in mind that this is my left, this is stage left, but to the viewer, it looks like I'm going right. So as you shift to the left, your left, what's going to happen is that swan is going to move right relative to the background. And so it's going to change the relationship. That is going to put the swan in the lower right part of this composition and the castle in the upper left, creating this dynamic diagonal visual relationship. So even though the vertical relationship here works perfectly well, always think about ways to turn that vertical into a diagonal, because I think that you'll find that you like those compositions a bit more. They're more interesting, they're more dynamic, they get the viewer's eye moving into different parts of the composition. So sometimes that vertical alignment works best, sometimes a diagonal alignment will work better. You need to try both if you can and see how it works out for you. But this is an absolutely fabulous photo. You nailed it. Great job. This shot is by Dennis, and it is of the tidal basin of the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. And I used to live in Washington, D.C. for several years, so this is a scene that I often photographed. And I think this is a really lovely image. I love the backlighting on the autumn leaves. I love the sun star peeking through. I love that you've got the memorial reflected in the water, and even that bench itself is an interesting part of the composition. But I do think that there could have been something different done with this photo to take it up to the next level. So for example, maybe the addition of a human element, someone sitting on the bench thoughtfully gazing out. I think that would have been a bit more interesting. And I also think that you might have wanted to change your position a bit to get this scene to come together in a more intriguing way. So one thing that catches my eye is the visual merger between the bench and the tree trunk. So I think at the very least, selecting a position that would have opened up some space between those would have been a good idea. And I also noticed that the reflection of the Jefferson Memorial in the water is merging with the edge of the walkway. So just a little bit of different positioning would have avoided those visual mergers. And I also think that if you moved around, you could have found a way to make that arcing tree branch frame the monument in the background a little bit better. So when I'm working with framing elements, I'm thinking about the shape that's created by the frame and then the shape of the subject that's being framed. And I try to find a position that will perfectly nest the subject in the frame. So here, there is this curve formed by the leaves, and that curve would fit really nicely around the monument in the background. So I kind of feel like if you change your position so that the monument was a little bit more to the left, that shape of the frame would have nested perfectly with the monument. So don't get me wrong, this is a fantastic photo. I think it's a really peaceful, tranquil, and beautiful scene. There's a lot of things going on with it that are really, really nice. But I do encourage everyone to think very critically about your position and move around until you get all of those visual puzzle pieces to work together in a way that optimizes your composition. Of course, this is something that I talk about a lot in my Ultimate Photography Composition course. And if you haven't checked that out yet, I strongly encourage you to do so. Simply put, it is the best course out there on the topic of composition. The next photo is by Alan, and this is a guy blowing giant bubbles into the air. And I think this is a really great backlit subject. Those bubbles are completely transparent and they definitely will allow a lot of interesting light and color to pass through them. But Alan, there are a few things you need to do. First of all, you need to straighten that horizon. The horizon's a little bit crooked, and that's a simple fix in Adobe Lightroom or most other image editing programs. Get that horizon straight, because that slightly crooked horizon is going to bug a ton of people. Like, you can go really crooked and make it obvious that it's intentional, but when it's just a little bit crooked, that kind of lands you in this uncanny valley where people are like, whoa, I don't think he did that on purpose. I don't like that. People don't like crooked horizons, so straighten that horizon out. The second thing that I think you should have considered when you were making this photo is just getting down a little bit lower. And what that would have done is it would have pulled that sun down behind the man blowing the bubbles. And it would have been something that would have framed the man and perfectly haloed around him. And I think that really would have taken this up to the next level. So it was definitely a good subject and a good moment to be making the photo. But even when you are working in the moment, you got to think critically about these little things that you can do to make your photos better. Keeping that horizon straight, getting down a little bit lower to pull that sun down behind your main subject, those would definitely have taken this to the next level. This photo is by Bartosz. Once again, probably getting the name wrong. And this was photographed in the lava fields of the Big Island of Hawaii. And having been there myself, I'm here to tell you that these lava fields are beautiful, especially the ones that are relatively new, because there's a lot of glass in the lava. So when it cools and forms into rock, the rock is surprisingly reflective. I mean, it looks like it's black rock, but when it catches the light just right, you get a lot of light and color reflecting off that rock. So it's really beautiful and the shapes are incredible. And I think that Bartosz did a fabulous job with this photo. I like the fact that there's this reflective surface in the shot. And I also like the moment that was chosen to take this photo. The sun is still high enough so that there is actually light on the foreground. And that's really bringing out those shapes and that texture in the foreground. And those curving shapes just lead perfectly to the sun setting in the background. So I think this is really nicely done. And with a wide angle lens, if you stop down to a small aperture like f11 or f16, you'll get that beautiful sunburst effect, which is what we see here. And that's a really great way of adding an eye-catching element to your composition. So overall, really nicely done. This is a fabulous photo. I love it. So this next photo by Buddy also uses a sunstar, but as you can see, the sunstar here doesn't quite look as good as in the previous photo. And there are possibly two reasons for this. One, Buddy used a 55mm focal length for this shot. So if you want to get that sunstar effect, sunstars are going to look better with wide angle lenses. As you move into the longer focal lengths, the stars get less and less attractive and eventually they pretty much disappear. It's really hard to make a sunburst effect with a super long telephoto lens, for example. So the wider the angle, usually the better the sunstar is going to look. And also, not all lenses are going to produce the same quality sunstar. Some lenses will do a better job than others, and lenses will have different numbers of aperture blades, so you'll get different numbers of tines on your sunstars. So those little spikes sticking out, that's going to change depending on what kind of lens you use. And the best lenses will have coating on them, so they will control flare better than cheaper lenses, and so you'll get a better looking sunstar and you won't get a lot of lens flare with the professional lenses. But some of the cheaper consumer lenses are likely to have less quality coating and you'll end up with a lot of flare. So you can end up with a sunstar that looks really, really bad. But as a general rule of thumb, go wide, that'll help you get a better sunstar, and stop down. You don't need to stop down to like f22. You can stop down to f16 or f11. The reason why I avoid f22 is that there's an optical defect called diffraction, which limits image quality. But generally, the more you stop down the lens, the better the sunstar is going to look. So I try to get down to f11 or f16. I avoid that f22 diffraction limited aperture if I can. And usually f16 or f11 is all that you need to get an attractive looking sunstar. So for this photo, if Buddy had used a wider focal length, I think he could have also gotten a bit more of a dramatic composition. I think this is a really nice composition. I like the way that this old pier leads out to that wave that's crashing in front of the sun. And then you've got the sunstar. And I like the diagonal line that he used here. But if he had gone wider, then that pier would have looked smaller. And he would have had to have stepped closer to it to keep it the same size in the image frame. So with the longer focal length, those lines on the left and the right of the pier appear to be mostly parallel, but if he had gone wider and gotten closer to the very beginning of the pier, perspective distortion would have kicked in more and those lines would have become more diagonal and they would appear to lean in and converge in the distance, creating this really effective vanishing point effect. And I think that would have taken this really nice composition and made it a bit more visually compelling. But overall, Buddy, you did a great job with this photo. It's really nicely done. Just a slightly different approach would have made the sunstar look better and would have taken the composition up to the next level. I really love this next photo by Chris, and this was taken on a barrier island along the South Carolina Atlantic coast. And this is some dead trees in the water that are in an area being reclaimed by the sea. And I think this came together really nice. I like how the one primary tree frames the smaller tree in the background, and then that tree frames the sun that's rising. So you've got this Russian nesting doll effect of the big tree, and then the shape is repeated by that smaller tree, and then there's that next shape of the sun and its reflection in the water that's framed by that. So each shape nests within the previous shape. And I love the colors. I love that there's some clouds in the sky that are picking up a little bit of color and creating some shape. The reflection is perfect. There really isn't anything that I would do differently with this photo. I think it's really nicely done. Great job, Chris. This next photo by Gary is also quite nice, and I think it's a very solid composition. Everything works nicely. You've got the lighthouse on the right. You've got the rising sun, or maybe the setting sun. I'm not exactly sure which way this is facing on the left, and the two are nicely balanced. And I like that S-curve formed by the shoreline. The one thing that I might have considered doing differently here is to have lengthened the exposure time to smooth out that water. So when you've got choppy water like this, there's a lot of texture in the water. And it can be kind of easy for the viewer to get lost in all that texture, and it's going to distract the eye from the most important parts of the composition, which are the lighthouse and the sun. So by lengthening the exposure, possibly with the assistance of a neutral density filter, which is a filter that just cuts down on the amount of light coming into the lens, by lengthening that exposure, that choppy water would smooth out. And I think this would look more attractive, and it would also make the reflections look better. So you'd actually see the lighthouse reflection and the reflection of the sun a little bit better with that smoother water. So definitely the next time anyone's photographing a scene like this with water, consider doing that longer exposure. And it's a good idea to carry a neutral density filter with you to help you achieve that longer exposure smoothing effect. Okay, this next photo is by Chuck. And Chuck, this is a really beautiful photo. I love the composition. I love this sculpture. The city skyline in the background's great. The sun star peeking out is wonderful as well. There's some really great color here. And Chuck, although this is a lovely photo, I do have one bit of advice for you. It applies to this photo and to a lot of the other photos I've seen from you in the past. And it's simply this. Lay off the magenta slider, bro. I mean, Chuck, these photos you're submitting are beautiful. They really have great compositions and they've got a lot going for them. You don't need the extra assist with the magenta slider. And if I could just get serious for a moment, I have to say, kids, just say no to the magenta slider. I know it seems fun and recreational at first, and all the cool kids are doing it, but you're gonna find that once you start sliding over to magenta, you're never gonna be able to slide back. And before you know it, all of your photos are going to look like they ran into a purple unicorn. So just say no, don't do it. Just hold back on that magenta. So this is a really beautiful photo, Chuck. And I think if you just lay off the magenta a little bit, it's going to look really good. And, you know, I think with something like this, when you're getting heavy with the magenta, some people may really like it, but a lot of people are going to be turned off by it. And so if you just lay off the magenta a little bit, no one's going to be unhappy with it. And everyone is just going to see the natural beauty of this incredible composition. All right, this photo by Ginny is really nice. This is of the mail pouch barn. I've seen this photographed before, and I really like the fact that she included the sun in this photo, and I like the shadows on the snow. All that fresh snow is really beautiful, and so there's a lot going for this image. Ginny did note that she was trying to get a higher position to avoid the merger between the fence and the old cars that are parked in the yard, but that she had a difficult time doing that. So one thing you might have been able to do if you couldn't get higher is to maybe press a little bit forward. That would have changed the angle and the relative positioning of everything. I think if you move forward a little bit, then that fence would have separated from those old cars. Another thing you can do is to just get up on top of something. So sometimes I'll crawl up on the top of my vehicle, or at least I'll open up one of my doors and crawl up onto the seat inside so that I'm standing up on the edge of the vehicle just to give me that extra height. I think that can be really helpful to avoid these visual mergers. Sometimes you just need to get up like another foot or two, and that's all it takes. In a pinch, you can even step on your camera bag if you don't mind squashing some of your equipment. And, you know, it was snowy out. Maybe you could have built like a little snow ladder to step on or something. You just got to get creative to give yourself that little bit of extra height. Other than that, I think that the most challenging part about this is the sun. So the sun isn't forming that really nice, attractive sun star. And I think that there would have been a few things that might have helped you get that sun star. So it may be that it's partially blocked by a cloud. And so you want to wait for the moment when the sun is peeking out from the edge of the cloud, and that'll give you that nice sun star effect. Another thing that might have helped here would have been to wait for the sun to be lower in the sky, or I guess if the sun is rising, you would have wanted to shoot this earlier. Problem is when the sun is higher in the sky, the light's not as colorful, and it can sometimes be more difficult to get that really nice starburst effect because there's nothing that's really blocking the sun at all. So when the sun's lower, you get some atmospheric haze that can help reduce the intensity of the sun just a bit. You don't want it to be reduced too much. You want to just take the edge off of it, and that'll make it easier to get a nice, colorful sun star. You'll notice with a lot of the successful sun star photos that we've seen in this critique episode, the sun's usually just above the horizon. And so that will help out a lot. Absent that, having the sun lower, so maybe that it was peeking out from the edge of the barn, that would have been another way to cut down on the intensity of the light and allowed you to get a really nice sun star without getting a lot of flare. But one thing you want to do is avoid shooting into the sun if the sun is being blocked by some hazy clouds, because you're just never going to get the sun star effect. But that said, I think this is a really nice photo. You did a really good job with it. Very well done. This photo is by Thomas of a heron on top of a post with the sun setting behind it. The sunset color is really nice, and I like the idea of having the sun behind the heron, but I do think that you needed to do a few things differently here, Thomas, to make this shot more effective. So first of all, I think a longer focal length or having gotten closer to the heron would have been a good idea here. There's a lot of empty space around this that you probably didn't really need to include in this composition. So a tighter framing or getting closer would have been ideal, but that's okay. You're probably working with the lens that you had, and maybe getting closer would have scared off the heron. So we'll move on to the next thing that I think that would have made this better. And that would have been waiting for a better pose from the heron. So this pose is a little bit squatty, and it looks like the heron's kind of looking away from you a bit. And so you're not really getting that really nice profile of the bird. So I would encourage you to keep working with this concept, but to try to get a better pose from the bird. And then the third and final thing that I think would have been really great and would have made this composition very successful is if you had timed it so that the sun itself was surrounding the heron. So here it's a little bit low. It's actually below the post. And you might have been able to change that by getting lower when you made this photograph. So by getting lower, the sun would have risen higher relative to the heron. But generally what you want to do is have that sun just perfectly framing your subject if you can. I think that's going to be much more effective and much more dynamic. Having that halo behind your subject is really going to draw the viewer's eye there, and there will be no doubt that that is the most important part of your composition. I talk a lot about using halos when making photo compositions in my Ultimate Photography Composition course, so if you want to learn more, then check it out. This is a really dynamic photo by Jeff of some sunflowers, and I love the fact that he's got the sun star just on the edge of the primary flower in this composition. I think overall this is really dynamic. There are just two things I might have done a little bit differently. First of all, I would have given this a little bit more breathing room at the top. It's cut a little bit close to the very top of the flower, so you definitely don't want to include a lot of empty blue skies in your compositions, but you also don't want to cut the top of the image frame too close to your subject. Second of all, and I see this a lot when people are using some sort of merge to HDR feature, either in Lightroom or Photoshop or some other program, you just got to be careful when you bring the images together with an HDR program, because sometimes you can get some weird artifacts and some halos around the edges of where the blend is taking place. And so there's a few HDR artifacts here. So when you're processing the image and you're doing that HDR merge, just look at it carefully as you adjust your settings and try to avoid having any of these weird little artifacts pop up. But overall, Jeff, this is a really beautiful photo. It's really dynamic. I love the composition. Really nicely done. This next photo by Josep is really beautiful. The color is great. I like the scene. He's got this lighthouse. But this gets back to that conversation we just had with that heron photo. So I think this would have been more effective if Josep had timed it differently. So right now you've got the sun just touching the very tippy top of that spire that's on top of the lighthouse. And for me, this merger is just a little bit weird. It doesn't feel right to me. So I think this would have been better if the sun had been higher and there had been some physical separation between that spire and the sun itself, or if the sun had been lower and that ball of the sun was completely framing that top part of the lighthouse. And I don't mean the spire of the lighthouse, but I mean that rounded bell at the top of the lighthouse. That is what you wanted the sun to be around. I think that would have been much more effective, creating that halo effect, drawing the eye to that most important part of the composition. So waiting for the sun to come down a little bit lower, of course, the sun's coming down at an angle, so you might have had to move around a little bit to make sure that it perfectly framed that bell shape at the top of the lighthouse. But waiting for that moment would have been the perfect moment, and it would have brought this composition together in a really pleasing way. This photo is by Lily Chang, and this was taken in the Namib Desert of Namibia. This is the famous dead fly where you've got all those dead trees surrounded by the sand dunes. And I think this shot is really effective. I love the radial pattern formed by the shadows created by the tree. I love the sunburst effect. I love how this flows from the lower left, where the shadows come in, to the upper right, where the tree and the sun star are located. But once again, I think this needs some more breathing room. You've got the top of those branches cut off. You've got the top of the sunburst cut off. So either a wider focal length or maybe moving back just a little bit so you could include more of the scene, or just adjusting your camera angle up a little bit would have given you the necessary breathing room at the top and made sure you weren't cutting off the sun star and the trees at the top. Those are very important shapes that you want to contain within the composition. So this is a really great shot, but just a slight tweak in the way you positioned it would have made it even better. And finally, we get to my favorite photo that was submitted for this round of critiques, and this is a photo of a concert taken by Randy C. Finch, and I love everything about it. I love the use of silhouettes here. I love how the silhouettes help define the shapes created by the light. So you've got these two triangles of light coming down, and one of those triangles is framing the singer perfectly. So that really draws the eye. I love the backlighting fringe around the edges of the singer's hair, and his clothing are just catching that backlighting, and it appears to be glowing from within, and that's really beautiful. I love, Randy, that you included some of the heads of the concert goers that were in between you and your subject. That creates this great visual progression that helps draw the viewer deeper into the scene. So they start off with the heads, they move to the singer, and then finally they go up to those shapes formed by the light. And the light itself, you've got a little bit of a light burst going on there, which is really great. So a lot of your visual elements here are in the center from left to right. So the foreground heads and then the singer in the background are both pretty much centered from left to right, but having that burst of light in the upper left helps restore some energy to this composition, and it breaks up the symmetry. It makes it much more dynamic. So I really can't say anything more. This is a fantastic image. I love everything about it. Congratulations, Randy. You are the winner of this episode of the Photo Critique and the winner of the $50 gift card with Hunt's photo and video. Excellent job. Well, that's it for today, and thank you so much for submitting all of these wonderful photos to the Photo Critique. Check out the description below this video for information on our next photo challenge. Stay tuned for our next photo adventure, and don't forget to subscribe to Shuttermonkeys here on YouTube. I'm Ian Plant, and I'll see you next time on the Photo Critique. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Here are a few more great videos that I think you'll enjoy and learn a lot from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get notified by ringing that bell so that you always know when we drop our next helpful video.